Hello, everyone. This is Ms. Strickler, and I'm here to talk to you about a portion of Module 7. So, what we have for Module 7 and actually for your final project is linked together. Module 7 is really important for us to understand what a memoir is and what a memoir is made up of, so that in our final project we can start thinking about what kind of topic that we want to write about. So listen up for some good information about a memoir. So I think a good place to start is what a memoir is. Now, this reminds me, you probably want to watch this video with the actual assignment document up as well. There's going to be some things for you to take notes on based on our discussion here. So, what a memoir is. This might be a term that you're familiar with, or it may not be. But what it is a nonfiction story, a nonfiction piece written from the perspective of the author about an important part of their life. So, another word that you may be more familiar with could be a little confusing to you right now, because this story about someone's life, I can hear some of you saying, I thought that was an autobiography. So let's take a look at the differences between the two. So an autobiography, if you look on the left-hand side here, is written from the perspective of the author. That's the same as a memoir on the right-hand side. An autobiography, though, spans the author's entire life, where, if you look on the right, a memoir looks at one piece of the author's life, so a pivotal moment, and then expand on that event or person or relationship through storytelling. So an autobiography is the entire life. A memoir is just a section of the author's life. As far as what it focuses on, it is about the person's life for both the autobiography and memoir. But on the autobiography side, we see it primarily focuses on facts of his or her life's timeline. So the 5 W's and the H, right? The who, what, where, when, and why, and how. So the facts, kind of the straight facts of what happened. Where a memoir, there's a bit more flexibility because it's about the events as he or she remembers them. And if I'm sure you've had the experience of having maybe a different way of interpreting an event than someone else who has experienced the same event. So there's flexibility because the facts that are getting retold are being retold through the lens of the author. I thought something that was interesting that I found out here, the word memoir, we can tell it even sounds French, right? But it comes from, I don't know if I'm going to butcher this, memoir, which means memory. So just, I think that connects really well to not necessarily objective, straight facts, but the way that the story is told is through the lens of the author and how he or she remembers. Okay, here are the 6 elements of a memoir, and I think this is part of our notes here too. So a memoir focuses and reflects on the relationship between the writer and a particular person, place, animal, or object. It explains the significance of that relationship, and it leaves the reader with one impression of the subject of the memoir. So it's focused in on one impression and this relationship between the writer and the subject. Could be a person, place, animal, or object. I would say or event as well. It's limited. We just mentioned that. Limited in scope, in time period of the author's life. It makes the subject of the memoir come alive. And it maintains a first-person point of view. So all memoirs are going to use I throughout. It's first-person point of view, It is a subjective piece of writing. Wanted to quickly expose you to one modern memoir called The Glass Castle. I know this was a book that was in my classroom library. Some of you may have seen it or read it. My particular copy was a different cover, but I liked this one because of something that I have linked in our resources as well. So this is a book that has become a movie. And in the resources, if you check out the Google slide where you get your assignments and links to resources, there is a trailer for the movie called The Glass Castle, and then also an interview by the author, Jeanette Walls. So an interview that she has given to, I think it's two news anchors, and they're discussing the subject of their book. I have read this book, and it's very powerful. I was going to tell you a bit about it. I'm reading just from a summary here of a little snippet just to give you kind of the perspective here. It says Jeanette Walls is riding in a taxi in contemporary New York City on her way to an event when she looks out the window and sees her mother digging through trash. Although her mother has been homeless for years, Jeanette feels a sudden sense of shame and gloom about her mother's life and begins to reflect on her own childhood and how her mother and father's choices affected her. It opens the door to her childhood. It kind of takes her back, basically, beginning when Jeanette is 3 years old and standing on a chair to reach the stovetop as she boils her own hot dog. Get that, 3 years old, and she's making her own meal and on the stove with boiling water. Her pink dress catches on fire and she gets horribly burned. After a few days in the hospital, Dad shows up, lifts Jeanette out of bed, and they do, quote, the skedaddle, leaving the hospital without paying the bill. Much of Jeanette's memories of her childhood in the desert focus on the skedaddle and how the Walls family, Mom, Dad, Lori, Jeanette, Brian, and eventually little Maureen, moved to a different desert town, settling for as long as Dad can hold a job. However, Dad's paranoia about the state and organized society, along with his alcoholism, leads them to move frequently. So they move a lot. And they're always just not having this stability in their family. Alcoholism is a major part of Jeanette Wall's life with her family, her dad. And what we have is this modern adult who is looking back on her life. We can tell that the piece is probably going to be that first person that we talked about, using I throughout. We heard the beginning part, how it opened up with this 3-year-old little Jeanette Walls making her own hot dog with boiling water on the stove and catching fire and having an injury because of that. So it really focuses in on one specific memory that then she continues, and it's an entire large piece of her memoir. But that is a good exposure to a modern memoir. This is an essay, we could say an essay format of a memoir, a much shorter piece. And this is by a middle schooler, actually, and it's called A Teacher's Lessons Live Far Beyond the Classroom. So I'll read this with you, and then we'll look back at what makes this a memoir. At some point in our lives, we've all been touched by someone, a person whom we admired, a person who inspired us. A former teacher of mine touched my life in that way. Lois King, my 6th grade language arts teacher, always inspired and showed me how much she cared. And what we see here in the opening, we've got interesting details to draw the reader in, and then we get information about the topic of the memoir. This Mrs. King, the 6th grade language arts teacher, and the relationship that our writer has with Mrs. King. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too. Those lines from Rudyard Kipling's If remind me of Mrs. King. I can recall many times when she told us, her students, not to worry what other people think of us. We were always to have a smile on our faces no matter how gloomy things looked. Gosh knows Mrs. King always had a big smile on her face. Trust yourself. Mrs. King reminded us to believe and trust in ourselves, to do what we honestly believe is right. An old saying that Mrs. King had on her desk sticks out in my mind. What may be popular may not always be right. What may be right may not always be popular. And yet don't look too good nor talk too wise. Don't try to be someone you're not. Be yourself. Those are some things Mrs. King instilled in her students. I can still hear her strong voice planting those words in our minds. If you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make thoughts your aim. Dreams and goals were important to Mrs. King, but she was wise enough not to allow us to dwell on our hopes and fears. I can recall many field trips when Mrs. King was just as happy as could be. We would go hiking, rafting, or visit museums, and her powerful and amusing laughter kept everyone on track. Before I go to the next slide, which finishes this memoir piece, I wanted to point out how throughout it's very obvious that it's first person. And what the writer has done, beginning here in the fourth paragraph, is connecting a poem that reminds our writer of Mrs. King, and take that each time that there's italics, that is something from the actual poem. And he's using the poem to connect his experience with Mrs. King to the reader so we can understand what Mrs. King was like. Okay, here's the rest of the memoir. I remember well when our school experienced some dangerous and severe weather, almost a tornado. I was scared as I could be. Not to fear, though. Mrs. King was there. Not only was she there to ease my pain, but she recited that familiar poem, If. If you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same. She did. Or watch the things you gave your life to broken and stoop and build 'em up with worn-out tools. In other words, move on, no matter the circumstances of life. Mrs. King had her ups and downs in life, but she did that. Shortly after school ended for the summer of my 6th grade year, I learned Mrs. King had cancer. In the fall, she could not return to her job. I began writing her small notes to keep her spirits up. Then in winter, basketball season began, and Mrs. King's 7th grade son, Robbie, played on Westport Middle's team. The day that Kammerer played Westport, Mrs. King walked into the crowded gym, and the first thing I noticed was her smile. It was so big. The next, her laughter. It filled the room. When the buzzer signaled for the game to begin, Mrs. King gave me a hug, and I returned to my seat. That day is special to me because I was able to see and talk with Mrs. King for the last time. When I learned that Mrs. King had died May 6th, I did not take the news well. At the funeral home, with that special poem, If, clutched in my right hand, it hurt so much to see that strong woman whom I'd admired, incredibly lifeless. But as I went forth to say goodbye, her laughter and motivating voice rang in my head. It was a comforting sound that allowed me to understand that Mrs. King's spirit will forever live. She had the will that said, hold on. So what we saw the writer do here to finish out this memoir piece, what we see, remember that the memoir is limited to the time and experience that the writer had with Mrs. King. We have no details other than the time that he or she had with Mrs. King for not any other part of his or her life, just that relationship. So it was focused in, like a memoir would be. And throughout, not just in this part that I kind of am leading us to, but we've got descriptive text. We have it everywhere to make the subject come alive for the reader, that we can almost feel as if we were there to see and hear Mrs. King and hear her laughter, and 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 feel the sadness of when our writer was at the funeral home after Mrs. King had died. So the memoir is this focused piece that really is taken in and described for the reader, connecting us, the reader, to this relationship of a person, place, thing, or event that the writer has been affected by. So this is important for you to think about as you begin to think of topics that you could focus in on for a memoir of your own, which is what the English 10 final project will be all about. So check in with the details. Check in with your teachers, Miss Hayden, Miss Basile, or myself, when you have questions about completing this project. And we're really excited to read or view or listen to. You'll see all the choices that you have, your memoir, and learn more about you and give you a chance to express yourself as well. Thank you so much, and let us know what we can do to give you a helping hand to finish out the year. Thanks.